the heart of Catholic education, though, is the fact that the Word himself has become flesh. The Eucharist is the heart because, yes, we're learning things in the classroom, but when we receive the Word of God, truth itself is coming into us in a tangible, embodied way. We become a temple of our Creator, of our Redeemer, but that unlocks reality. It kind of goes back, right? Back and forth. Like we're trying to teach reality to our students. They experience that reality in the Eucharist. And as they experience it, they can then look at things differently. They can look at the world with a sacramental imagination because of the experience that they had of the Word made flesh.
Welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockel. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I sit down with inspiring guests, and together we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. Welcome, everyone, to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Jared Staudt from North Carolina. He's joining us, the author of a relatively new book on Catholic education, Words Made Flesh, The Sacramental Mission of Catholic Education, published by, I believe it's Catholic University of America Press, but it's an imprint within that, the Adeodatus series on Catholic education and culture. Dr. Staudt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to meet you. We've never met before, even though our paths have crossed sort of in the e-world with the different things we write and speak about. I'm delighted to have you here. Why don't we start with having you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, especially as it relates to Catholic education.
Well, Catholic education is very personal. I know many of us can say that, but literally it saved my life. So I was kicked out of the public school in 7th grade, and no other private school would take me in except for the local Catholic school. And I was a non-practicing Catholic and struggled even to get my first communion. It took me 3 tries, And just coming into the school, I really felt like I had found my home. I had really found a sense of purpose. And even early on, that was 7th grade, but by 8th grade, I knew that I wanted to give my life to teaching the Catholic faith. And that year, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is brand new. I read it cover to cover, had a really profound experience in confirmation where I even felt an outpouring of this gift of teaching. And so as I've gone through my studies, I was always looking for opportunities to teach. I had my first catechetical job while I was earning my master's degree in Catholic Studies at St. Thomas in Minnesota. So I was a parish DRE there and had been really active, in campus ministry and founding a Catholic club at my alma mater. I went down to Ave Maria in Florida for my doctorate and was the founding DRE of the parish there. And I was hired by the Augustine Institute for my first full-time teaching job, but we were focused on the new evangelization. I was hired to teach catechesis, and I interacted with so many teachers that to me, it really confirmed this calling from the Lord, that this is what we need right now in the church, is this outpouring of the truth, but in a way that is really transformative of our lives. And I really discerned a call while I was at the Augustine Institute to work for the renewal of Catholic culture. So not just education itself as the transmission of ideas, but the living out of these ideas in a transformative way in a particular place in a community through culture, just meaning a way of life. From the Augustine Institute, I went up to the University of Mary to direct their Catholic Studies program for a couple of years and came back to Denver to work for the Archdiocese of Denver. And so I worked initially as the kind of diocesan DRE and worked in restored order confirmation. and then moved over to Catholic schools. So I was in Catholic schools in Denver for 4.5 years, was associate superintendent for mission information. And so a lot of the book that we're going to be discussing came out of that work of forming teachers, forming future principals, current principals. And during that time, I helped to found 2 Catholic high schools in the Archdiocese of Denver, independent high schools, but that were cooperating with the Archdiocese. And then 2 years ago, we moved out to the Carolinas, South Carolina, and now we're kind of rooted in North Carolina where we built a home. But I've continued to work in education here. My main job is with Exodus 90. I'm their director of content, so giving daily spiritual formation for men. But at the same time, I've had opportunities to work with different groups in both states. In Greenville, South Carolina, I've helped to found Rosary College. So I created their curriculum, 2-year associates program, kind of focused on this Catholic studies model. And then I've also brought that to Charlotte Catholic High School, where I've helped to found a new program starting next fall called the St. Augustine Scholars Program.
Wonderful. So a long history. It would be interesting for us to compare notes and timelines because I think we're about the same age and probably did our grad studies around the same time. And I've also ended up obviously working with Catholic teachers through my own route. So it's interesting to hear how it's worked with you. And UMary is not very far from us. I'm in Regina, Saskatchewan, and UMary is just a few hours south and east. So it'd be great to compare notes.
Right? You know,
Pardon me?
There's probably nothing in between, just empty,
not a lot.
Old plains, right? You know,
yeah. But so you already hinted at this, but my next question was to tell us a little bit about this book, where the idea of it came from, the experiences that it grew out of, and you've already started, but let's go more specific to the book itself.
Well, I mentioned that call to evangelize culture that I believe that I received from God. And so my first book, and this is kind of funny because we're talking about Catholic education, but it was actually called The Beer Option, Brewing a Catholic Culture Yesterday and Today, and looking at how monks were instrumental in creating beer as we know it, even though it goes back to biblical times. And from there, you know, I've really been trying to lay out a complete vision of culture in all of my books. This is my second book on education. The first was actually a collaboration with the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education called Renewing Catholic Schools. But I laid out a whole plan for the renewal of culture in a book called Restoring Humanity. And I've looked at religion as the heart of culture in a more academic book. And so this book in particular, Words Made Flesh, is really focused on how education is a creator of culture and really flows out from our own great history of Catholic culture for 2,000 years, which we are now transmitting to a new generation.
It makes a lot of sense as you describe it, because I just finished reading it. I told you I frantically read the last 2/3 of it in the last 18 hours. But yeah, the focus on culture is really central. And I would say for listeners of this podcast who might be familiar with my own work, it's a great compliment because my own book doesn't go into a ton of detail on those kinds of questions. These things are implied. But if you were looking for a follow through on some of the stuff that I talk about that embeds things more deeply in culture, I would recommend this book as a great sort of follow-up. So that makes a lot of sense. When I first saw the book, I think it was, on LinkedIn or something, you posted that the book was coming out. The title really grabbed my attention. I love the idea of words made flesh. When I speak with English teachers, I jump off from the biblical discussion of words, and that words become flesh. That's what they do. Like literally, right now, we're shaping the air around us, which is being picked up by various bits of technology to transmit it somewhere else. But we're changing the way people's neurons are firing by using words, right? Like words are meant to be embodied. And so the subtitle is where I really want to ask you to share with us the vision of the book, the sacramental mission of Catholic education. And throughout the course of the book, this idea that a Catholic education is sacramental is articulated in a whole bunch of different ways, whether you're talking about how you interact with technology, how you interact with parents, how you interact with different subject matter. So talk to us about a bit about your title, and then maybe particularly this idea of how appropriate the adjective sacramental is for describing a Catholic education.
Well, the sacraments are really at the heart of the Catholic faith, especially the Eucharist. And I do have a whole nother book on the Eucharist and culture, how the Eucharist can save civilization. And so all of this really does cohere. But I would say one of the biggest problems that I've seen in Catholic education is that we can focus on transmitting ideas. So with my experience with whether it's religious education or with Catholic schools, well, look at this textbook. Isn't this a great textbook? So what, right? Because that largely bounces off of the kids. How do the words that we are transmitting in the classroom that are in that textbook, the great books or whatever book that we're using, or the words of the teacher, how do they take on life in the student's own family and in the community of the school and parish? I think that's how we really are going to see things change and even really stick, because words are not enough. I say, like, words are cheap. I guess not if you're sending your kids to Catholic schools, and it's not cheap. But talk is cheap. How does this actually turn into action and to become something that is really lasting? So there are a number of ways, and I would say, first of all, it is the sacraments that Jesus, when he gives us the form of the sacraments, right? It is his speech. This is my body, right? That becomes transformative. So we do look to the sacraments themselves as this kind of model where you have speech that becomes transformative, even on a material level, but most importantly, a spiritual level. When we talk about the curriculum as a whole, though, I think that the vision that we transmit to our students needs to be sacramental as well. All of reality, visible reality, is a sacrament of the mind of the Creator, right? Jesus is the Word of God, and he speaks forth creation. He spoke and it was made, right? And so the visible world is a kind of sacrament, an outward sign of something that is hidden and invisible, which in this case is the Word of God himself. And so it is a sign that points us back. Our bodies are sacramental in that sense, right? Because we come from the mud of the earth, that dust, which the Lord breathes into. So it is a kind of speaking, right? He puts his breath into us. And there are so many ways in which we can see this, right? When we look at reality as a whole, are we teaching our students to look at it from that perspective, that everything is a concrete expression of the mind of the Creator that reveals something about him? Every little thing, right, is a sacrament that reveals something of the Creator. And then the heart of Catholic education, though, is the fact that the Word himself has become flesh. The Eucharist is the heart, because yes, we're learning things in the classroom, but when we receive the Word of God, truth itself is coming into us in a tangible, embodied way. We become a temple of our Creator, of our Redeemer. But that unlocks reality. It kind of goes back, right? Back and forth. Like we're trying to teach reality to our students. They experience that reality in the Eucharist. And as they experience it, they can then look at things differently. They can look at the world with a sacramental imagination because of the experience that they had of the Word made flesh. And then I would say, finally, I would, and of course, there's so many other ways that we could look at this, but even the fact that we want our students to put what they learn into action, right? We want them to go out and we want them to transform things, right? So, when we think of the sacraments, right, it is about transformation. The bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. We receive the body and blood of Christ and we become the body of Christ, transformation. And our students can become that kind of leaven in the world. That they should become creators of culture. I think we have a primal vocation given to us by God to be creators of culture. And I think we can look at that as a kind of sacramental mission, that everything in life is deeper and more important than it looks on the surface. And we're kind of bringing our faith into it and transforming things in the world through our faith and through the presence of Christ in us. And so we can say, like, in this cultural mission, that we are bringing the Lord's truth, goodness, and beauty into the world.
Right. I'm really struck by the framing of a sacramental approach. So the main sort of vision or focus of our community is learning how to think about every particular subject, math, science, history, whatever it is, from a Catholic point of view. And the framing you give of like everything, so this would apply to the study of history. This would apply to the natural sciences. What you're doing is kind of sacramental work because each of those things points beyond themselves, right? And there's always this like test case in my kind of work. People are like, but like math, like really, like they could sort of get it. Like what you were just saying, I think is pretty straightforward. If we wanted to talk about art, people wouldn't be like, you can't tell me that art has a sacramental, like that one is kind of easy for people to buy, but math, they're going to be like, but math is an exception, of course, to this idea that everything is a sacrament. Like, how is math sacramental? So I just wanted to note, like, when I got to page 74, and there, by the way, there's a chapter in your book that is dedicated kind of to this basic idea, right? Chapter 4 is really about approaching everything with a Catholic worldview. In that chapter, you talk about math as sacramental. So I have to give you an opportunity to elaborate on that, because that comes up literally all the time in the work we do here at Making Every Class Catholic.
Well, it's kind of funny. You would think that you could take for granted that 2 + 2 = 4. And yet we've seen in the last 5-10 years that people have challenged that. So I like to say to teachers, why does 2 + 2 = 4? They're like, well, yeah, it just does. Okay, but why? And there is a way in which we take math on faith, right? It's something that we accept. We don't create it, right? It's a logical, even kind of language. And what's amazing about mathematics, it's not just like a logic puzzle, but it's literally the language through which God created the cosmos, right? That it has a mathematical order to it. And so mathematics, like everything else, expresses the mind of the creator. When we learn math, we are tapping in to God's own language he instilled within it. And, dogs cannot access mathematics, right? This is something intelligent. Now, it's not sacramental in the same way that I think science is, because, of course, science paired with mathematics, right? You kind of get that whole thing, because in a way, mathematics is the order, behind the structure of the universe that only an intelligent being can perceive. Now, if you're studying trees, well, yeah, a dog can interact with a tree, can go up and scratch a tree or whatever, but it can't know what a tree is. And so there is something about math and science both that, math helps us to kind of get into the mind of the creator. And then science helps us to see how that was expressed concretely in the visible world. So when teachers, and I love to do this, one of my favorite things, talking about Catholic worldview, I'd say, why do we learn math? And teachers always want to say, what's their focus? Well, because the students, they need to prepare for the next level.
Right.
Well, why? Well, because, they want to do well and their tests and even their standard achievement tests. Why? So they can go to college and they can get a job. And, so math is utilitarian. And, there's different ways of being utilitarian, right? Because one is, well, I want to be able to count, the money in my bank account. And okay, that's utilitarian, or to be able to, transact something. Or it could be utilitarian as this is what I really hear. It's a means to something else. Like math maybe isn't that important in itself, but the students need it so they can go on and do other things, because very few will be, mathematicians or engineers and physicists and things like that. So, you check the box, you show that you can do it, and then you move on to something else. And that's totally wrong. Math is part of the liberal arts. Why? And because if you think about it, if we go back to math as an expression of the mind of the creator, well, if I'm tapping into that, what is that doing to my mind? Right? Truth is the conformity of the mind to reality. And, you can't encounter the number 2 on a hike. Oh, there it is. I see it. Take a picture of it, right? Something, it's intelligible, right? And so as your mind is attuning to the intelligible reality of mathematics, it strengthens it.
Right.
It fosters logical thinking and diligence and all these other kinds of mental skills that are actually important for everything else that we're learning. And it's one of the ways in which we see the connection of the different disciplines.
Right. Geek out with me as a theologian for a second, because there's something that's coming to my mind as you were describing, right? So humans encounter reality in this way and recognize the patterns and the structures and describe this through math and that sort of thing. And a dog, doesn't, despite its own way of encountering reality. But I was thinking, like, considering angels might be interesting here, right? So angels don't need sacraments, right? And tell me what you think of this, but I think angels don't do math either, because their knowledge is immediate and human knowledge is mediated, which actually means it follows a sacramental pattern, right? Sacraments are a form of mediation. And so the way you were describing our interaction with reality through math is a way of describing a kind of mediated engagement, because we live in time and space and we know one thing at a time and we learn one thing after another. Like, that's the way our knowing operates, right? And math fits with that. And that in itself is a kind of analogy with sacraments, whereas angels who don't need sacraments, I suspect, don't need that mediated way of encountering, reality that we use when we're doing math. But I'm just throwing that out there because it just occurred to me as you were talking.
Well, we could say it this way. Angels know math. They don't do math, right? Angels don't have to work out math problems. They know the answer intuitively, right?
Right.
And so it's not that
or
they
even
don't
the deeper
understand.
thing that the answer itself is indicating. Yeah.
Yeah. So, intuitively, they simply understand mathematics, right? Because if it is this logical structure of the universe, they know it. But they don't have to discover it, right? And they don't have to work so hard like we do through all those equations.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, that was a little theological geeking out, but now the book is like 12 chapters. You go through a lot of different stuff. There's a chapter on parents. There's a chapter on technology, chapter on arts and history, and lots of different stuff gets covered. And we can't cover all. We could do a podcast on each one of the chapters. So, in lieu of diving into each one of them, tell us a little bit about the organizing principle of the book and some key themes that you think were important throughout these various chapters. How did you decide that this was the way you were gonna structure it and this is what you were going to include?
Well, I would say that it starts broad. And then it kind of narrows down to what do we do with all of this. So I would say it gets more and more concrete, maybe in Sacramental fashion, right? So we start with kind of the bigger ideas. So I lean very heavily into mission, like why we have schools, what we're trying to accomplish at the beginning. Wanted to make sure that chapter on parents is up there very early on, because that's essential to that mission. And then forming disciples. So kind of these key things: disciple, being student. We can't form effective students without the primary role of parents. That's been shown to us in so many ways. So, I'm really trying to get at the fact, even with the term sacramental, that education really is all encompassing. If you look at Newman's idea of a university, he said, well, liberal education at its core is the cultivation of the mind. And yes, there's instruction and practical things, and there's religious formation. And elsewhere, he says, but I want all of those things under one roof. And so I take that very seriously to say, this is not just about the mission or the transmission of ideas abstractly. Right. It's really about the formation of the whole person. And that's a very popular thing to say, but Catholics are positioned to do that. so much more effectively than anyone else, that we really can form body, mind, soul, and then even our body and soul as social beings, right? So we need to hit that cultural, that social dimension as well. So the beginning of the book really lays out these general parameters of the mission. And then I move into the curriculum, how the curriculum itself, embodies those principles. And then I would say, as the book goes on, then it gets more concrete in the sense of looking at outward expressions in art, in music, looking at elements of culture. So it ends with building culture in the school. So broadly speaking, I would say the first section is about mission. The middle section, which is probably the longest one, is about curriculum. And that does get into cultural aspects there as well. And then it ends with looking at concrete embodiment. And that includes even challenges. So part of that concrete embodiedness is dealing with the challenge of technology.
So within the curriculum, we could dive into any number of these, but I was saying to you before we went live, I was reading this, cramming before the thing. And when I got to the chapter on art, I 2 or 3 pages in, I thought to myself, like, this is what he loves. Like talking about this, thinking about this, and the role of beauty in particular. By the way, just for the listeners' benefit, the chapter on art also includes music. They're done in the same chapter. You can see why that would make sense. But take a minute to talk about the value of art and the role of art in a authentically Catholic education. And maybe I should say sacramental education.
Exactly. Sacramental. Yeah. We often call them specials, in the United States. I don't know if that's also the case in Canada, but, that art and music are specials. In gym, sometimes that's called a special as well. And, I really want to say emphatically, right, to educators that those 3 areas, art, visual art, music, and gym, physical education, are absolutely essential to Catholic education, right? Because if our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, I think it's part of the reason that, once again, the faith is not sticking is because it's not sacramental. It's not embodied enough. And so, or you have athletics sometimes even competing against Catholic mission, right? And we need to integrate things. And so we can't just say, oh yeah, we'll let the kids kick some balls and run around for a little bit. That's not how the Greeks thought, right? The gymnastic was, more than just even the physical part, right? It included actually the arts as well. Kind of recovering the gymnastic is very important. So, and I've been very struck by something that Bishop Barron says in the book version of Catholicism, right? Because that's a video series. But when you get the book form, at the beginning, he said, could you really say that just kind of, and this is not a direct quote, but he's saying, can you really just say that with the creed and the sacraments, that's enough, that's the essence of Catholicism? Or would you really need to look at the Confessions of St. Augustine, Chartres Cathedral, the Sistine Chapel? Are those also essential to understand what Catholicism is? And so I hate to say it, but we're graduating a lot of students that do not know the Catholic Church. You say, well, what do you mean? I had religion class. And I kind of argue against even that term religion class in the book, which is ironic because my dissertation's on the virtue of religion, but as a virtue, right? So I think it needs to be catechetical and theological rather than abstract religion. But so we're graduating, students that have had a lot of tests on religion, that have been forced to go to mass, however often it is, but they haven't read Dante. They may have heard the name Thomas Aquinas, that they don't really understand Gothic cathedrals and what a great accomplishment they were. They may not know what the Camino is. They probably don't know Gregorian chant and have sung it, even in its intended place, and there's just these great treasures. I mean, we're talking about world altering treasures. I mean, Gregorian chant has impacted music all across the world, and people are listening to it, best selling, Billboard albums and all these things. And our students, you'd say, what about this, great Latin hymn? Do you know that? I'm like, oh, what are you even talking about? I've never heard that before in my life. So they don't know. I mean, Mozart's masses. You're like, Mozart's what? It's, he did operas, right? He did masses too. And we have some of the greatest cultural treasures. And this is why I say it's not optional. It's not like, well, there's these things that you should get information about. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel from this date to that date. It's the experience of these things that is not optional, right? Because they were transformative of world history. Why? Because they're transformative, and they can be transformative for our students. And yeah, I mean, it's looking at pictures of the Sistine Chapel is one thing. Of course, you can do a virtual tour now, but it's also going and seeing the beautiful things that we do have in the Americas as
Right.
well.
I'm thinking as you're speaking, like they're being formed by art one way or another, right? If you know every song in the Taylor Swift catalog, it is forming you, right? It's not an option to be formed by art. Like that is going to happen, right? And like there's a place for a sort of engagement with contemporary pop culture too. That's not a thing that we like run away from. But being aware of the formative capacity of art and knowing that it's happening one way or another, and then being intentional about the Catholic heritage and its potential in that sort of endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think of like Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, right? Well, I think one of his key insights is that pop culture has formed young people much more even than the great treasures of Western civilization. They're like on the shelf, and every now and then we kind of, do a little bow to them. They're over there, right? But our students are not really immersed in them, especially in a living way, because
Right.
anyone could do art appreciation. But in a Catholic school, it's not just music appreciation, art appreciation. This is a way of learning our faith. That's what I think Bishop Barron was trying to say. Not just learning about Catholicism, but you're not really entering into the depth of your own faith and tradition and community if you're ignorant of even the greatest things that have guided us through the centuries.
Right. Well, to go to your point about religion versus theology, when I meet someone on a plane and they ask me what I do, and I say I'm a theologian, and some people know what that is, but sometimes you have to explain it. And what they know is they would know what a religious studies professor is. And so you can start with that, but then you have to make the distinction, right? Like you can be an atheist and be a professor of religious studies, but you can't be an atheist and a theologian, right? Like it presupposes the act of faith, right? You actually have to live in it. You can't just know about it. And I think that's the same for any of this stuff, right? Giving people information about the faith, whether it's history or art or whatever it might be, is not the same as giving them the opportunity to live in and even enjoy what it means to live in that sort of context, right?
Yeah, and the reason why I recommend the term catechesis for elementary and maybe up into middle school, it could be debatable, but really catechesis means echo, right? And what are you looking in those younger grades, right? You want them to learn their faith and be able to kind of echo it back, right? To not just verbally, but also in their action. Catechesis is a kind of initiation. And our young students are being initiated into the faith. And once again, our faith is embodied in the community, right? And in our culture of the school, of the parish, but ultimately that's in the sacraments. Catechesis is ordered towards the sacraments. And then theology is faith seeking understanding. So when I say that we should call it theology, it's not like trying to do necessarily academic theology with the students, but can we get them to start seeking? I remember, teaching Theology 101 to college students. And I said, theology is faith seeking understanding. And I said, it's very difficult to teach theology to those without faith and who are not seeking. And so I would say in those years, what we're really trying to do is to help them to seek, like we've been in catechesis, we're trying to instill faith. And then when they get older, we don't just want them to be passive in response to information. We want them to seek and to find.
Right. Beautiful. One of the chapters that stood out for me, I think it's chapter 6. It's called Progressive or Sacramental. So we're back to this adjective of sacramental. Progressive, I think, fairly describes like most of what would happen in most contemporary education. It's been formed by the education faculties, where a huge percentage of our teachers would have got their education degrees. And formed in the thought of people like John Piaget or John Dewey, these kinds of thinkers. But one thing that really struck me, I think it happened throughout the book, but it became much more explicit in this chapter, is that there are genuine goods and genuine goals that are sought by the people who articulate this progressive vision of education. And I went to an ed faculty 25 years ago, and I heard a lot of these kinds of things. But sort of the proof in the pudding seems to point in the opposite. The things that they say they want, which are genuinely good, are often not what is produced by the practice they endorse. And what you're describing in this book as sacramental, what I often call just an authentically Catholic education, often has better results on the metrics that the progressive themselves set. And you highlighted this 2 or 3 times throughout the book, and especially in that chapter. I wonder if you might say just a little bit about the sort of paradox of that. And then I have a couple really key themes in contemporary education that I want to throw at you and sort of bounce around a little bit. But before I introduce those, just some thoughts on the paradoxical nature of this.
Yeah. Well, I'm drawn back to thinking about St. Augustine here, because he had a classical education. And, he's studying like Virgil and whatnot. And when he made mistakes in class, his teacher beat him. He literally. And he says, oh, and my parents laughed about that. It's not funny. That hurt, And there's something about that, right? That there's something good that you should have. And we want you to memorize that and then imitate that. And if you fail, you'll be punished. And the reason I put that out there is we could kind of say that model predominated for over 2,000 years. And the progressive educators really saw themselves as liberators. No, it's not just about taking our students and jamming them into like this ancient model, read these books, memorize them. And if you don't, you're in big trouble, whatever. And they said that makes them very passive, makes them uninterested in what they're learning. And that stuff's not useful anyway. Okay, they memorize Virgil. Who cares? And you can imagine some of these guys, right? And so what they said is, no, we need to focus on students. We need to be student focused. And this is where I point out the irony is that actually what they proposed was not in conformity with human nature at all. It was all their own kind of pseudo-scientific thinking about how they could come up with a scheme that would be more fitting for their students. But if we look at what the progressive educators wanted, right? They wanted hands-on experience. They wanted the students to be more driven in a pursuit of discovery. And they wanted it to be, some of them even said culture forming. Talk about Dewey, right? He said that, the education is going to form our democratic society, right? And they said, so some of these principles, I would say, those are good principles, right? So they wanted to throw classical education out the window. And this is where we come back to sacramental and why I think that this is actually something different. Can we continue to focus on the truth, right? The progressive educators, they don't like the word truth. And they would even say, we don't teach truth, right? And they might say that they teach facts, but they don't like truth, right? And even the difference there is fascinating. So they throw that out the window, right? There is no truth that we're trying to give to our students, right? They'll create their own truth, or something like that. But if we take the focus on truth and then we pull out some of the things that the progressive educators want, well, can we work with the interests of the student? Can we allow them to engage more in a process of discovery through their own experience and even delight in what they're learning rather than getting beaten like St. Augustine, right? And even my dad in the public schools in the 1960s was still being beaten. So it's not that far away, actually. He probably deserved it. But anyway, that's another topic. And to even then, to have this to be transformative of culture and experience, so experience is kind of like the big word for the progressive educators. And the classical thinkers are like, no, we just need to read and talk about great books. That's it. It's just the ideas. That's what matters. And I'm saying, well, can we bring the ideas and the experience together? It's sacramental. And so there are things that we can learn from the progressive educators, even as they failed to accomplish them.
It's interesting to me, the two things you just highlighted, experience and ideas. If you focus on one, the other isn't going to disappear. You just might not notice it. But if you're focused on ideas, people's experience is going to be informing how they engage. There's just no way around it. Like, we're embodied beings. Like, our experience is going to shape us. And same in the reverse. If you say we're focusing on experiences and we're not talking about ideas, well, that's an idea, actually. Like, you're like, you can't duck this stuff. So the sacramental, as you described it, it's just more honest about the approach. But if we actually conceptualize it as involving both of these aspects of human reality, then you'll just be less likely to have blind spots. And I think that this is one of the things that happens with contemporary education. And I'll throw a couple terms at you and get your thoughts on it. But I did an ed degree. Of course, we talked ad nauseum about critical thinking, right? We're going to teach critical thinking. And somehow, after I don't know how many decades of talking like this, we don't see any marked improvement in our graduating students' capacity for critical thinking. Everyone agrees that critical thinking is important, but there was a certain way of talking about critical thinking that imagined you could do it in a way that abstracted from truth claims, which was itself a truth claim. That like, it just, the whole thing felt really fuzzy and sort of tangled. And it seems to me that, yeah, everyone's going to agree critical thinking is a good outcome we should all be aiming for. But at least one of the ways of approaching it and emphasizing it doesn't seem particularly great at achieving it. And so that just struck me. That's not something you dive into in your book, but it struck me as an example of what you were talking about.
The place I touch it most closely is in the chapter on history. Because history was replaced by social studies. So we'll give you a bunch of facts and information about society, and then somehow that's going to make you, ready to go out and be a productive citizen, et cetera, et cetera. But this is where the critical thinking comes out. There was actually, like, the Fordham Institute did a study, and they said, well, what is it about social studies that could help students? And they said it was reading complex texts. And then even the ACT board said that they thought that the best thing for test preparation was reading difficult and complex texts. And so sometimes when you even just pay attention to the data you see, once again, critical thinking doesn't just come about talking about critical thinking. It comes about when you really, it's even going back to Newman, when you focus on the cultivation of the mind. Well, how do you do that? Is you engage the best of what has been said and written, you can say thought and said, right, throughout the centuries. And you really try to get even into the arguments. What is this text saying? Why is it saying? How is it effective? How is it not effective? I mean, but you're really getting deep into that. And a lot of contemporary educators, they would even balk at the notion that some texts are more worthy to read than others. And this is where we can talk about classics. Why is a book a classic? Because it has been valued by people and societies for sometimes centuries or even millennia. And it's withstood the test of time as having something to say. And sometimes people today are like, no, this book of gibberish is even better. You know what I mean? It's just like the latest talking points, but it's not saying anything. So to get the students, I mean, critical thinking doesn't actually mean anything anyway, right? So what we want our students to do is to be thoughtful, to be able to understand difficult things, to respond to them, right? So we want them to think deeply and to be able to respond through deep conversation and to be effective and persuasive writers. These are classical skills. And I just say that in a general sense, classical. Classical education wants to lean into them. And I would say, you look at what our schools are doing today, they're throwing grammar out the window, right? And they're throwing classic texts out the window. They don't want to teach history. They're teaching social studies. And people, I mean, listen, I don't think I'm a crazy person for saying this, but people are not able to read difficult texts today and to engage them deeply. And I think we're pretty ignorant of history. And so you just hear people talk and it's like we're missing a depth of knowledge and understanding that would have been taken for granted throughout all of civilization. And it's breaking down today because of things like, well, we want all of our students to be critical thinkers. And you say, what does that mean?
Right. So here's the second one I want to throw at you. Everyone would agree, critical thinking would be good if you could define it. But I mean, I think we kind of know what when we encounter someone, we know if they're doing a good job of that or not. And we want people who can.
We'd fire them if we found one who was actually doing it,
A second,
You're thinking too much. Be quiet,
A second idea that struck me or theme is creativity, right? So I think a lot of the language around progressive models of education would want creative students, and I don't know of anyone who doesn't want that, But then the question of how does that actually come about? So something like memory, for instance. In the long tradition, memory would have been intimately related to creativity. But under a lot of contemporary rhetoric, something like memorization is seen as almost the opposite, or as something stultifying with respect to creativity. And so we talk a lot about producing, creative problem solvers or creative artists or whatever. But I'm not sure that our methods achieve that worthy goal.
Because in order to produce good poetry or good art or good music, there has to be a kind of storehouse of knowledge and also skill. And I think we want to throw our students and to say, just be creative. But they don't have anything to draw upon. And, great artists do begin by imitation. I mean, even the great geniuses of art throughout history, right? They begin by imitation. And we want to say, no, all that stuff that's in the past. And one of the things that I think put my finger on is the fact that we hate history, and so when you look at why there is this breakdown of transmission of culture and skills today, I think part of it is because we just think we're a lot better than the past. And one of the ways I think we think we're better is that we're so individualistic. And so the individual should not have to conform to something else, right? I mean, the masters of the past, well, if you're just imitating them, well, then your individuality is diminishing. So we equate creativity with individuality.
Right.
And so this is to go back even to this whole idea of progressive or sacramental. The progressive educators, they want students to then be able to go out and to do things. But look at our culture. We don't know how to do anything anymore. And so we're actually not teaching skills. And I would say that's true in Catholic education and also public education. You look at trade schools and tech schools and all these things, like, the VOTEC, they've disappeared. So we're not thinking deeply, but we're also not doing proficiently either. And so, when I was creating the index for the book, this is kind of funny. I have, an entry on work. And I do look at the Benedictines as a model of prayer and work, as this kind of interior and exterior, right? But I kind of surprised myself. I'm like, oh, work is coming up all the time in this book. And I'm like, why? This is where I think we have been missing something even in Catholic education in the past. It's all, about thinking and not enough about doing. And, today there's a lot of utilitarian focus in education. I want my child to be educated to be successful. So then there's a reaction against that. No. We don't need to care about being successful at all. Let's just read the great books and, we'll do some paintings and then our kids are ready to go into the world. And my response to that is, why does it have to be one or the other? Like, I don't want my kids in a utilitarian school where they're doing math and science just so they can go out and be great engineers, because Newman says that a liberal education is useless and therefore it's the most useful thing that there is, because it can apply to everything. Because if you're trained to do one thing, well, then that's all you can do is one thing. But if you're able to think and to judge and to act, right, you have wisdom, you have the virtues,
communicate,
you can go out anywhere, right? In business, in the military, you could be a teacher, whatever it is, a lawyer, doctor. I mean, you're ready. Now you need to learn skills too, right? So this is where I think we need liberal education, like this formation of the mind, as Newman spoke of it, a formation in faith. And we need to be prepared to actually to go out and to be successful from a Catholic perspective, right? Not just like go out and be rich for its own sake or something like that, but to really go out and apply what we've learned to support your family, to build up society, support the church and extend the mission of the church in the world. So I don't think we should be fearful of career preparation. And I think if we want a renewal in the liberal arts, we better bring these two together. Oh, here it is, Sacramental, bringing these things that are usually apart back together.
Right. So we're coming near the end of our time for the short version. We do have an extended version for members of the community. And so after we sign off, we'll stick around and take a few questions from the community. But I want to finish this part with noting at the end of the book, the last little bit is quite practical. You described some work you did in the Archdiocese of Denver in school renewal. And again, that could be a whole episode to go through all the details of that. I want to pick out one piece that you describe in there, and I want to hear a little bit more about this. New teachers coming in now I'm looking at my notes. A Catholic worldview seminar, a 4-day Catholic worldview seminar if you were a new teacher in the Archdiocese of Denver. And I thought, man, what I would do and so many Catholic school boards and dioceses to have something like that at the front end, especially because so many of our teachers are not being formed in Catholic institutes of higher education. They're not coming with that worldview necessarily. And so talk to me about this 4-day Catholic worldview seminar for beginning teachers.
So we had, for a long time, a 4-day kind of lecture course on the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Stafford instituted it, and that's wonderful, right? But I said to the Archdiocese, why don't we take that, right? We'll still engage the Catechism over 4 days, but from the 4 pillars, let's spring into the curriculum. And that way, we can show teachers that the Catholic faith really does relate to their work. It's not like just an add-on, right? That's what I'm always trying to work against. The Catholic faith is not an add-on. So the first pillar of the Catechism on God and creation, we connected that to mathematics. The second pillar of the Catechism on the sacraments, we connected that to the sacramental imagination and literature. The third pillar on morality, we connected that to the human person who must be understood not only morally, but also biologically. So we got into science. We connected that in terms of anthropology. And then finally, the section on prayer, we connected to the mission of Catholic education as embodied in history, right? History as this unbroken chain, one generation to the next that we're a part of, receiving this great tradition and passing it on in the school. So that's how we set it up. And it was an interactive seminar. So I capped it at about 30 teachers a day, kind of sat in a circle. We read the texts out loud together and discussed them. And I had some breakouts, getting in the small groups. I gave them also some quiet reading time. So we kind of mixed up the way that we operated throughout the day. But the teachers gave me very good feedback. to say that, when they're sitting there all day long with a lecture on the catechism, they go into passive mode, right? So I wanted them to become active and engaged and really to see the connections of the Catholic faith, especially in those 4 areas, but we made also some connections to other areas of the curriculum as well.
Well, I've seen this with teachers. If I practice making connections in one subject area, teachers who have their own expertise in another subject area start recognizing the pattern and applying it. So I've been surprised by teaching, right? So I wrote a book that I could put 8 chapters on different subjects in, and there's 20 chapters that aren't in there. There's no chapter in psychology or business or computer science or whatever, but I go work with teachers and I might talk about literature or art or science, and then the psychology or the aviation teacher in one case came up with all these great ideas and these great connections. So I'm not surprised that you always have to pick some limited amount of things. You can't do all the things, but if you do some of the things, I mean, they've got their own experience and expertise too, and they're going to start to see the patterns and be able to make the connections, so that even if you can't cover everything, you give them the tools they need to be able to start doing that work on their own, right?
And I think the key unlock for a lot of teachers is they kept hearing, we want all of our classes to be Catholic. So they thought that meant taking theology and trying to insert it into their classroom.
Right.
And what we were trying to show them is that, no, it's your discipline that is what connects into the Catholic worldview. It's coming from within, not being imposed from without. Right? How do we approach math? That's the example we gave before, right? And just teach that from a Catholic perspective, not like bringing in points of the catechism, but by focusing on probably more of the philosophical dimensions. Why are we doing this? Why does it matter? How does it connect to other things? And that is really where the light bulb went off.
Right. I'll often say to teachers, like, there's science questions deserve science answers, but there's questions about science that are not themselves science questions, right? And once they can see that distinction, they can say, okay, you're not imposing theology on my sort of methodological independence, right? You're still letting me be a science teacher, but there's important questions about science. And here's the thing, you're not going to be neutral about them. You're not going to not answer them. They're going to be answered through what you do and how you approach it and why you think it's valuable, whether that's explicit or implicit. Right? Intentional or willy-nilly. So in a Catholic school, let's actually think about these big picture questions and how they apply to those things. So it's super interesting. We need to talk more because I think there's so much parallel in the work we're doing. Before we sign off, tell our listeners where they can find you, where they can find your work, what you're up to these days that they should know about.
Well, if you're a man, you can follow my work at exodus90.com. And we have a daily app where you can get spiritual reflections, and Exodus 90 is kind of our big thing that we do the 90 days up to Easter. My own blog, I wish I could write there more often, but it's buildingcatholicculture.com. And then you can find my books on Amazon and then maybe go off to the publisher's website from there.
I always recommend support your Catholic publishers. Amazon is gutting all of us. So if you can, or your local Catholic bookstore. I'm sure Dr. Staudt would not be offended if Catholic bookstores had to order his book and keep a few extras on the shelves. So,
and we do have another book coming out in the Adeodato series. So I edited this with Alex Fossard, and it is the history of Catholic education from Jesus the teacher to St. John Henry Newman. So that's coming out this summer.
Okay. Well, congratulations on that. Congratulations on this book. Thank you so much for being with us. God bless you and your work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters and presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.